Upon boarding a business flight to New York, the millionaire froze when he saw that the flight attendant was his wife who had died 7 years ago. He approached, and Ethan Calloway stared out the small airplane window, watching Chicago's skyline shrink beneath a blanket of evening clouds. The city looked different from 30,000 feet. Smaller, manageable, like the miniature models he'd built as a kid down there. Somewhere between those glittering towers was the life he was trying to leave behind, at least for a few days. "Another scotch, sir." The flight attendant's voice pulled him back to the present. He glanced up, ready to decline, when the world seemed to tilt sideways. Time didn't just slow. It shattered completely. Rachel. The woman standing beside his seat had Rachel's honey-colored hair, pulled back in a neat bun. She had Rachel's soft brown eyes, the same slight curve to her lips when she smiled. She had Rachel's voice, though it carried a professional warmth he'd never heard before. But Rachel was dead, had been for 7 years, 3 months, and 16 days. "Sir?" The attendant, who couldn't possibly be Rachel, tilted her head slightly. The scotch. Ethan's throat felt like sandpaper. Yes, please." She poured the amber liquid with steady hands that looked exactly like the ones that used to trace patterns on his chest on Sunday mornings. Hands that had worn his grandmother's wedding ring until they'd slipped beneath the dark waters of Lake Michigan. "Flying to New York on business?" she asked. The question casual, routine, something like that. His voice came out rougher than intended. He couldn't stop staring at her face, searching for some detail that would break the spell, prove his mind was playing cruel tricks. "Well, we should have you there right on time. It's going to be a smooth flight tonight." She smiled, that same lopsided smile that used to make his heart skip, and moved to the next passenger. Ethan's hands trembled as he lifted the scotch to his lips. This was impossible. Rachel Whitmore Calloway had died in a boating accident 7 years ago. He'd watched the Coast Guard pull pieces of her yacht from the water. He'd buried an empty coffin. He'd spent 3 years in therapy learning how to function without her. "Get it together," he told himself. "People look alike. It happens." But when she returned an hour later with dinner service, she moved with Rachel's exact gait, that slight favor of her left leg from an old soccer injury. When she laughed at another passenger's joke, it was Rachel's laugh, the one that started low in her throat before bubbling up like champagne. "Chicken or beef tonight?" she asked when she reached his row. "I'm not really hungry." He studied her name tag. Claire Rivers. Not Rachel. Of course not Rachel. "You should eat something," she said quietly, leaning slightly closer. Long flights can be rough on an empty stomach. That's when he caught it. The faint scent of lavender soap, Rachel's soap. The same brand she'd special ordered from that little shop in Vermont because she claimed it was the only thing that didn't make her skin itch. Claire Rivers straightened up, but not before slipping something between the napkins on his tray table. "Enjoy your meal, sir." Ethan waited until she'd moved on before unfolding the small piece of paper hidden among the napkins. The handwriting made his blood freeze. "Terminal B, Gate 15, 10:15 p.m. Don't call me Rachel." His meal sat untouched as the plane descended toward LaGuardia. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the galley where Claire, Rachel, whoever she was, went about her duties with professional efficiency. She never looked his way again, never gave any sign that she'd just turned his world upside down with 8 words on a napkin. The landing was smooth, just as she'd promised. Passengers began the familiar shuffle toward the exit, gathering bags and checking phones. Ethan remained in his seat until the plane was nearly empty, then made his way toward the front. She was there, saying goodbye to departing passengers with that same warm smile. When he approached, she handed him a small bottle of water. "For the road," she said simply. Their fingers brushed as he took the bottle. Her skin was warm, real, alive, not the cold touch of a ghost or the product of a grief-addled imagination. "Thank you," he managed. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Calloway." She knew his name. Of course she knew his name. It was on the passenger manifest. But the way she said it, with just a hint of familiarity, made his chest tight. Terminal B felt like a maze designed by someone who'd never actually walked through an airport. Ethan found Gate 15 with 10 minutes to spare, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The waiting area was mostly empty, just a few travelers sprawled across uncomfortable chairs, dead to the world. At exactly 10:15, she appeared. Gone was the crisp flight attendant uniform. Instead, she wore jeans and a simple black sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked exactly like Rachel had on their first date, nervous and beautiful and trying to hide it. "You came," she said, stopping a few feet away. "You're dead." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I buried you. There was a funeral. Your parents. God, your parents. I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know what it cost. What it cost everyone. Then explain it to me." He stepped closer, and she didn't back away. "Explain how my wife is standing in front of me when I watch them pull pieces of her boat out of the lake." Claire, Rachel, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Because the woman you married found something she wasn't supposed to find, and the only way to keep everyone she loved alive was to die first." The words hit him like a physical blow. 7 years of grief, of rebuilding his life around a Rachel-shaped hole, of learning to sleep alone and eat dinner in silence. All of it based on a lie. "I don't understand." "I know you don't, but you will." She glanced around the terminal, checking for watching eyes. "Meet me at the Marriott on Lexington tomorrow night, room 847. We can't be seen together, and we can't talk here." "Rachel, don't." The sharpness in her voice cut him off. "That woman is dead, Ethan. She had to be. Claire Rivers is the one talking to you now. And Claire Rivers is the one who's going to tell you why your wife had to disappear." She turned to walk away, then paused. "For what it's worth," she said without looking back. "Not a day went by that I didn't want to come home to you. But some doors, once you close them, can never be opened again." Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, leaving him alone with questions that felt too big for his chest to contain. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant about tomorrow's meetings, about the life waiting for him in Manhattan. But all he could think about was a woman who died 7 years ago, and the impossible promise of answers in a hotel room. He wasn't sure he was brave enough to visit. The flight home to Chicago was going to be the longest 3 hours of his life. The Marriott on Lexington felt like neutral territory, the kind of place where business deals were made and secrets were traded over overpriced drinks. Ethan had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, but his mind kept drifting to room 847 and the woman who claimed to be his dead wife. He'd almost talked himself out of coming 3 different times. At 8:47 p.m., he stood outside the door, his hand raised to knock. The hallway smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's lives. He could still walk away, could pretend the woman on the plane had been a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many 18-hour workdays. The door opened before he could knock. "I was wondering if you'd show up," Rachel said. She'd changed into a simple gray dress that he recognized, one he'd bought her for their 2nd anniversary. The fact that she still had it, still wore it, made something twist painfully in his chest. "I'm here." He stepped inside, and she closed the door behind him with the kind of careful quiet that suggested this wasn't her first clandestine meeting in a hotel room. The room was standard corporate fare: 2 chairs, a small table, a bed that dominated the space. Rachel had arranged the chairs facing each other, like this was a therapy session instead of a resurrection. "Drink." She gestured toward a bottle of scotch on the table. "I remembered it was your favorite. I don't drink Macallan anymore." The lie came easily. He'd switched brands after she died, because the taste reminded him too much of the nights they'd spent planning their future over expensive whiskey. Fair enough. She poured herself 2 fingers and settled into the chair across from him. In the lamplight, he could see the small differences, tiny lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a thin scar along her jaw that was new. "Ask your questions, Ethan. All of them. Start with why." He remained standing, needing the height advantage, needing to feel like he had some control in this impossible situation. "Why fake your death? Why put me through 7 years of hell?" Rachel took a sip of scotch, buying time. "Do you remember Charles Whitford?" "Of course I remember Charles. He was your mentor. Your boss at the foundation. He spoke at your funeral. He also wanted me dead." The words came out flat, matter of fact. 3 weeks before the accident, I was doing routine financial reviews for the Dawnlight Institute. Charles always said transparency was crucial for donor confidence. She stood and moved to the window. Looking out at the Manhattan skyline, I found discrepancies in the books, small ones at first. Donations that didn't quite match the reported amounts, expenses that seemed inflated. I thought it was sloppy accounting, but it wasn't. It was money laundering on a massive scale. She turned back to him, her face pale. Charles was using the Institute to clean money for some very dangerous people. Donations would come in from shell companies, get mixed with legitimate contributions, then flow out through inflated contracts to vendors that didn't exist. Ethan sank into the chair. Charles Whitford was one of Chicago's most respected philanthropists, a man who'd donated millions to children's charities and education initiatives. You have proof. I had proof. Banking records, email trails, vendor contracts. I copied everything to an encrypted drive. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her glass. Charles must have known I was digging because I got a visit from two men who made it very clear that my investigation needed to stop. You should have gone to the police. I tried. Her laugh was bitter. Turns out Charles had friends in law enforcement too. The detective I spoke with called Charles directly. That's when I knew I was in real trouble. She moved back to her chair, leaning forward like she needed him to understand every word. That night, I went home and found our house ransacked. They took my laptop, my files, even my phone, but they missed the backup drive I'd hidden in your golf bag. Ethan remembered that night. He'd been in Boston on business, had come home to find Rachel cleaning up what she'd claimed was a break-in. Nothing valuable had been stolen, which had puzzled the police. The next morning, Charles called me into his office. He was so calm, so reasonable. He said he understood I'd been under stress, that maybe I needed some time away. He offered me a sabbatical, paid, no questions asked. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. That's when he showed me the photographs. What photographs? Pictures of you leaving your office, getting into your car, walking into restaurants, pictures of my parents at their house in Florida, pictures of your sister and her kids at the playground. She met his eyes. He didn't threaten directly. He just said it would be such a shame if anything happened to the people I cared about. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Ethan had spent 7 years thinking he'd lost Rachel to a random accident. The truth was so much worse. The boat explosion. Captain Marcus Ellison from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division had been investigating Charles for months. When I reached out to him with my evidence, he proposed a solution that would keep everyone safe and give him what he needed to build a case. Rachel finished her scotch in one swallow. My death. Jesus Christ, Rachel. The yacht explosion was real, but I wasn't on it. Marcus had it rigged with enough debris to suggest a body that was never recovered. I was already in a safe house upstate, learning how to be Claire Rivers. Ethan's mind reeled. Every detail had been planned, choreographed like some elaborate magic trick where the only person who didn't know it was magic was him. 7 years, he said. 7 goddamn years, Rachel. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I know. Tears were sliding down her cheeks now. I know, and I'm sorry, but there's more. More. He didn't think he could take more. 2 weeks after I went into hiding, I found out I was pregnant. The words hit him like a physical blow. He actually felt the air leave his lungs. Pregnant. 3 months along. We have a daughter, Ethan. Her name is Amelia, and she's 6 years old, and she doesn't know we exist. The room spun. A daughter. He had a daughter he'd never met, never held, never tucked into bed or helped with homework or scared away monsters from under her bed. Where is she? That's the problem. Rachel was crying openly now. She was supposed to be placed with a safe family through the Witness Protection Program. But 6 months ago, I discovered that Charles has been systematically gaining access to federal placement records through his foundation's partnerships with child services. He knows about Amelia. He knows there are children in the system who might have information that could hurt him. He's been collecting them, Ethan, using his institute as a cover to monitor kids whose parents crossed him. Rachel's voice broke. Our daughter is living in one of his facilities. Ethan stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. We have to get her out. We have to. It's not that simple. If we move too fast, if Charles realizes we're onto him, Amelia disappears forever, along with dozens of other kids. Then what do we do? Rachel wiped her eyes, and for the first time since he'd sat down, he saw something like hope in her face. We're going to destroy him, but we're going to do it right this time, together. Outside the hotel window, New York hummed with its usual midnight energy, but inside room 847, two people who'd been torn apart by lies were finally beginning to plan their way back to the truth, and to the daughter they'd never had the chance to love. Rachel pulled out a manila envelope from her purse, the kind lawyers used for important documents. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, spreading photographs across the small hotel table like she was dealing cards in the world's cruelest poker game. "This is Amelia," she said quietly. Ethan's breath caught. The little girl in the photo had Rachel's honey-colored hair and his own stubborn chin. She was sitting cross-legged on grass, reading a book, completely absorbed in whatever story had captured her imagination. She looked happy, normal, like any other 6-year-old who didn't know her entire existence was built on lies and danger. "She's beautiful." His voice came out rougher than he intended. He reached for the photo with trembling fingers. "She looks like you. She has your eyes. That intense way you get when you're thinking through a problem." Rachel's smile was watery. "And your terrible habit of chewing on pencils when she's concentrating. How do you know that?" Rachel's expression darkened. "Because I've been watching her for 3 months." From a distance, the Dawnlight Institute runs a program called Future Leaders. It's supposed to be for gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds. They provide housing, education, everything these kids need. Sounds legitimate. On paper it is. Charles is too smart to run anything that looks obviously suspicious. The children are well-fed, well-educated, and by all appearances well cared for. But they're also completely isolated from the outside world. Ethan studied more photos. Amelia in what looked like a school uniform. Amelia with other children in a garden. Amelia at what appeared to be some kind of performance or recital. How many kids are there? 23 right now, ages 5 to 16. All of them are connected somehow to people who've crossed Charles or his associates. Some have parents in witness protection. Some are orphans whose guardians got too close to the truth. Some are kids whose families just disappeared. The implications made Ethan's stomach turn. He's holding them hostage. Insurance policies, Rachel corrected grimly. As long as these children are under his care, their parents stay quiet. Dead parents can't cause problems, but scared parents are even more reliable. She pulled out another set of photos, these taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. The institute is in upstate New York, about 3 hours from here. It looks like a private boarding school. Beautiful grounds, state-of-the-art facilities, everything money can buy. Security, extensive but subtle to anyone watching. It just looks like they're protecting valuable children from a dangerous world. Motion sensors, cameras, a small security staff that rotates shifts. The kids aren't obviously prisoners, but they never leave the grounds without escort. Ethan examined the aerial shots Rachel had somehow obtained. The compound was larger than he'd expected. Multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. Sports facilities, even what looked like a small theater. It would take an army to assault the place, and even then, they'd never get all the children out safely. "Have you tried contacting Ellison, the FBI agent who helped you disappear? Marcus retired 6 months ago. His replacement doesn't know about our arrangement, and according to my contacts, Charles has been very generous with political donations lately. Too many people owe him favors." Rachel leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "I've been Claire Rivers for so long. Sometimes I forget Rachel Calloway ever existed. I work for a small charter airline that flies executives and celebrities. It's the perfect cover. I can monitor flight patterns, track Charles's movements, see who he's meeting with. Is that how you knew I'd be on that flight to New York? I've been keeping tabs on you." The admission came out quietly, almost ashamed. "I know about your company, your success, the way you've rebuilt your life. I know you still wear your wedding ring." Ethan touched the band on his finger unconsciously. He'd never been able to take it off, even when well-meaning friends had suggested it was time to move on. "I never stopped looking for answers about what happened to you. I hired 3 different private investigators over the years. I know, I had to stay ahead of them." Rachel's smile was sad. "You're nothing if not persistent. Tell me about Amelia. What's she like?" Rachel's whole face transformed, lit up with a mother's pride and heartbreak. "She's brilliant, scary smart, just like her father, She reads everything she can get her hands on, and she asks questions that would stump most adults. She's kind to the younger children, protective of them. She pulled out one more photo, Amelia with her arms around two smaller children, all three of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. She plays piano beautifully, though I don't know where she learned. She loves astronomy and can name more constellations than I can. And she has this way of humming when she's content, this little tuneless sound that she probably doesn't even realize she makes. You've gotten close enough to hear her hum. I got a job with the catering company that services the Institute's events. Volunteers are always needed for their fundraising galas and donor appreciation dinners. It's the only way I can see her without raising suspicions. Ethan tried to imagine Rachel in another disguise, serving canapes to wealthy donors while watching their daughter from across a room. The thought of it made his chest ache. "There's something else," Rachel said. "Something I haven't told you." "What now?" "When Amelia was born, I made her a small blanket. Nothing fancy, just yellow cotton with little moons embroidered on it. I sewed a tiny crescent moon pendant into one corner. It was my grandmother's. The only thing I had from home." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver pendant identical to the one in the photo around Amelia's neck. "I had two made, kept one with me, gave the other to her. I thought maybe someday, if I could find her, she'd recognize it, know that someone had been thinking about her." Ethan took the pendant, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Such a small thing to carry the weight of a mother's love and 7 years of separation. She still wears it, every day. In every photo I've taken, every time I've seen her, she has it on. It's like she knows it's important, even if she doesn't know why. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the photos of the daughter they'd never been allowed to raise. Outside, New York kept moving, oblivious to the small tragedy unfolding in room 847. "So what's the plan?" Ethan finally asked. Rachel gathered the photos with practiced efficiency. "Charles is hosting his annual donor gala next month. It's his biggest fundraiser of the year. $2,000 a plate. Politicians, celebrities, anyone who's anyone in philanthropic circles. The children from the Institute perform for the guests. Amelia will be there. She'll be there, and so will Charles, in front of hundreds of witnesses, completely confident in his own invincibility." Rachel's eyes had gone hard, calculating, "It's the perfect opportunity to destroy him. How? I don't know yet, but we have 4 weeks to figure it out." She stood, smoothing down her dress. "Can you stay in New York for a few more days? There are people you need to meet, things you need to understand before we can move forward." Ethan looked down at the pendant still warm in his palm, then at the photos of the daughter he'd never held. 7 years ago, he'd lost everything, but maybe, just maybe, he was about to get the chance to win it all back. "I'll cancel my meetings," he said. The flight back to Chicago felt like traveling through a wormhole. Same airline, same route, completely different universe. Ethan had booked first class this time, partly for the privacy, and partly because he hoped Claire Rivers would be working the flight. She wasn't instead. He found himself studying every passenger, wondering if any of them worked for Charles Whitford, wondering if his decision to help Rachel had already put them both in danger. Paranoia, he was learning, was a difficult habit to shake once it took root. Rachel had given him a new phone before he left New York, something called a burner that couldn't be traced back to either of them. It felt like a prop from a spy movie, except the stakes were real, and their daughter was the prize. He was reviewing the notes Rachel had given him about Whitford's financial network when a familiar voice made him look up from his papers. Well, Ethan Calloway, small world. Charles Whitford stood in the aisle beside his seat, looking exactly the same as he had 7 years ago. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to perfection, that politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was traveling with a small entourage, a younger man who looked like security, an older woman who was probably an assistant, and a nervous-looking guy in an ill-fitting suit who screamed accountant. "Charles." Ethan forced his voice to remain steady while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Didn't know you were on this flight. Last-minute business in New York. You know how it is." Charles gestured to the empty seat beside Ethan. "Mind if I sit? My seat's in coach. And at my age, these old bones prefer a little extra legroom. Of course your seat's in coach." Ethan thought, You probably booked the cheapest ticket and planned to charm your way into first class. Sure, have a seat. Charles settled in with the satisfied air of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. I was just thinking about you the other day. Actually, 7 years since Rachel's accident. Can you believe it? Time has a way of getting away from us. The casual mention of Rachel's name made Ethan's jaw clench, but he kept his expression neutral. It does. I've been following your company's success. Of course, impressive growth, especially in the international markets. You should be proud of what you've built. Thank you. Ethan wondered if this was random small talk, or if Charles was fishing for information. With men like Whitford, there was rarely such a thing as casual conversation. In fact, I've been hoping we might have a chance to reconnect. The Dawnlight Institute is always looking for partners who understand the importance of giving back to the community, men like you, who've overcome personal tragedy and found success despite adversity. The irony was so thick Ethan could taste it. I appreciate the thought, but I'm not really in the philanthropic space these days. Understandable, given your history, but perhaps it's time to consider how your good fortune might benefit others. We're hosting our annual gala next month, our biggest fundraiser of the year. I'd love to have you there as my personal guest. Ethan's pulse quickened. This was the same gala Rachel had mentioned, the one where Amelia would be performing. Was this invitation coincidence? Or was Charles somehow aware that Ethan knew more than he should? That's generous of you. Think about it. You might find it illuminating. Charles's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. We do important work with children who have nowhere else to turn. Kids who've lost their parents, who need guidance and structure to reach their full potential. The way Charles emphasized certain words made Ethan's skin crawl. This wasn't an invitation. It was a message. Charles knew something, or suspected something, or was playing some kind of psychological game that Ethan couldn't quite decode. The plane hit turbulence suddenly, a sharp jolt that sent coffee cups sliding and overhead bins rattling. A few rows ahead, a child started crying. A little boy, maybe 8 years old, traveling alone and clearly frightened by the rough air. Without thinking, Ethan started to get up to help, but Charles caught his arm. Best to let the professionals handle it, he said quietly. But the flight attendant was busy securing loose items, and the boy's crying was getting worse. Ethan was about to ignore Charles's advice when another attendant appeared from the back of the plane. A petite blonde woman who moved with practiced efficiency toward the frightened child. It took Ethan a moment to realize it was Rachel. She knelt beside the boy's seat, speaking to him in low, soothing tones that Ethan couldn't quite hear over the engine noise. Whatever she said worked. The child's crying subsided, replaced by shaky but brave nods as she showed him how to breathe through the turbulence. That's interesting, Charles murmured beside him. What is that flight attendant? Something familiar about her, don't you think? Ethan's blood turned to ice water, but he forced himself to look only mildly interested. Not really. They all start to look the same after a while. Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching as Rachel continued to comfort the child. The turbulence smoothed out, but she stayed with the boy until he was completely calm, even pulling out what looked like a small puzzle to keep him distracted. She's very good with children, Charles observed. Professional, but with a personal touch. That's rare in commercial aviation these days. I suppose. When Rachel finally returned to the galley, Charles excused himself to use the restroom. Ethan watched him walk toward the back of the plane, noting how his steps slowed as he passed the area where Rachel was working. When Charles returned 10 minutes later, he looked satisfied about something. "Forgive me," Charles said as he settled back into his seat. "Where were we?" "Ah, yes, the gala. I do hope you'll consider attending. I have a feeling it's going to be a very memorable evening." The rest of the flight passed in stilted conversation about business and mutual acquaintances. Charles was charming, as always, but Ethan could feel the man's attention like a weight pressing down on him. Every casual question felt like a probe, every friendly observation like a test. When they landed at O'Hare, Charles lingered as passengers began to deplane. "Ethan," a word of advice from an old friend. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Some stones are better left unturned. The past has a way of staying buried when we let it. But it can be very dangerous when we start digging." "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do." Charles stood and gathered his things. Give my invitation some serious thought. And remember, some reunions are worth celebrating, but others— He paused, fixing Ethan with a stare that was no longer even pretending to be friendly. Others can be tragic. Charles walked away without looking back, leaving Ethan alone with the unmistakable feeling that he'd just been threatened. The message was clear. Charles knew something was happening, even if he didn't know exactly what, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his secrets. Ethan waited until the plane was nearly empty before making his way to the exit. Rachel was there, saying goodbye to departing passengers with professional efficiency. When he reached her, she handed him a small packet of peanuts. "For the road," she said, the same words she'd used in New York. Their fingers brushed as he took the packet, and he felt a small piece of paper transfer between them. He palmed it quickly, noting the tight set of her jaw that suggested she was as rattled by Charles's presence as he was. "Safe travels," she said aloud, but her eyes said something entirely different. "We're in trouble." Ethan didn't read Rachel's note until he was safely in his car, parked in the dim recesses of O'Hare's long-term garage. The message was brief. Lincoln Park Zoo, Penguin Exhibit. Tomorrow 2 p.m. Come alone. The zoo was crowded with families enjoying the unseasonably warm October afternoon. Ethan found Rachel sitting on a bench near the penguin habitat, wearing sunglasses and a Cubs baseball cap pulled low over her face. She looked like any other Chicago resident enjoying a day off, except for the tension in her shoulders that suggested she was ready to run at the first sign of trouble. "He knows," she said without preamble as Ethan sat down beside her. "How much?" "Enough to be suspicious, not enough to be certain." She watched a group of children press their faces against the glass, squealing with delight as penguins dove and surfaced in the cold water. "Charles doesn't make moves unless he's sure of his ground. The fact that he approached you directly means he's testing, not acting." "What did the note say?" "The one you passed me on the plane." Rachel pulled out her phone and showed him a text message from an unknown number. "Your flight attendant friend has a familiar face. Careful who you trust in the sky." "Someone's watching," Ethan said. "Someone's always watching. The question is whether they're Charles's people or federal agents keeping tabs on both of us." Rachel stood and began walking toward the African lion exhibit, keeping her pace casual. "There's something else. I made contact with my old FBI handler. I thought Ellison retired. He did, but he left behind a partner who's been quietly building a case against Charles for the past 2 years. Special Agent Chloe Bennett." They stopped in front of the lion enclosure, where a massive male was pacing near the fence. The big cat's restless energy reminded Ethan uncomfortably of his own state of mind. "Bennett wants to meet with you," Rachel continued. "She's been investigating the money laundering operation, but she needs someone on the inside to help her gather evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that can only be obtained at Charles's gala. He keeps the most sensitive financial records on a private server that's only accessible from his personal laptop. Bennett needs someone to get close enough to install monitoring software." Ethan turned to study Rachel's profile. "Someone like me. Charles already invited you. You have legitimate business credentials and a personal connection that would explain your presence. Plus, you're one of the few people who might be able to get close to his inner circle without raising immediate suspicions. And what about Amelia? How does getting evidence help us get our daughter back?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "Bennett has resources we don't. If we can give her what she needs to arrest Charles, she can coordinate with Child Protective Services to remove all the children from the institute simultaneously. It's the only way to ensure they all get out safely." They continued walking, moving through the zoo's winding paths like any couple enjoying an afternoon together. Except every few minutes, Rachel would glance over her shoulder or pause to check reflections in exhibit windows. "There's a coffee shop in Lincoln Park," she said. "Java Junction on North Avenue. Bennett will be there at 4 o'clock. She'll be reading a copy of the Chicago Tribune and wearing a red scarf. How very spy novel of her." "Ethan." Rachel stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "I need you to understand something. Once you meet with Bennett, once you commit to this plan, there's no going back. Charles doesn't just destroy people who cross him. He erases them, completely. Like he tried to do to you. Like he succeeded in doing to me. Rachel Calloway is dead and buried. If this goes wrong, Ethan Calloway might join her." The weight of what she was saying settled between them like a physical presence. Around them, families continued to enjoy their day at the zoo, blissfully unaware that two people were planning what amounted to a declaration of war against one of Chicago's most powerful men. "What about you?" Ethan asked. "What's your role in all this?" "I'm going to be working the gala as part of the catering staff. Bennett arranged it through her contacts. I'll be inside, but in a position where I can help coordinate the operation. And if Charles recognizes you..." Rachel's smile was grim. "Then we improvise." Java Junction was the kind of place that attracted a mix of students, freelancers, and people who just wanted good coffee without pretense. Agent Chloe Bennett was exactly where Rachel had said she'd be, looking like a young professional taking a break from her day. She was prettier than Ethan had expected. Mid-30s, auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, sharp green eyes that tracked his approach without seeming to. "Mr. Calloway." She folded her newspaper as he approached her table. "Thank you for coming." Ethan sat down across from her, noting how she'd chosen a table in the back corner with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the rear exit. "Agent Bennett." "Just Chloe, please, we're trying to keep this casual." She signaled the barista for another coffee. "Rachel filled you in on what we're looking for. Access to Charles's laptop during the gala. Install monitoring software. Gather evidence of money laundering. That's the basic outline, yes. But there are complications you should know about." Chloe leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that Charles isn't working alone. He's part of a larger network that includes politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. Some of them will be at the gala. Meaning we get one shot at this. If Charles realizes what's happening, he has the connections to make all the evidence disappear and all the witnesses relocate permanently." The barista brought Ethan's coffee, and he waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Chloe pulled out a small device that looked like a USB drive. "This contains a program that will copy Charles's hard drive and install monitoring software on his system. All you have to do is plug it into his laptop for 30 seconds. That's all. But getting those 30 seconds is going to be the challenge. Charles is paranoid about security, especially when it comes to his personal devices. The laptop will be in his private office at the venue, and the office will be locked and monitored." Ethan studied the device, surprised by how ordinary it looked. "How do I get in?" "We're working on that. The gala is being held at the Palmer House downtown. Charles always uses the hotel's penthouse suite as his base of operations during the event. We've identified a 15-minute window when his security detail will be distracted by the evening's program." "The children's performance," Ethan realized. "Exactly. Charles never misses their presentation. It's part of his public image as a caring philanthropist. While he's downstairs playing the gracious host, you'll have access to the suite." Chloe slid a business card across the table. It identified her as a marketing consultant for nonprofit organizations. "If anyone asks, I'm helping you develop a corporate giving strategy. We've been meeting to discuss potential partnerships with children's charities. And after I install the software, you go back to being a potential donor, enjoy the rest of the evening, and let us handle the technical side within 24 hours. We'll have enough evidence to bring down Charles's entire operation." Ethan pocketed both the device and the business card. "What about the children? What happens to them when Charles is arrested?" "They'll be taken into protective custody immediately. We've already coordinated with child services to ensure they're placed in safe environments with families who understand their unique situations, including Amelia." Chloe's expression softened slightly. "Rachel has made it clear that reuniting your family is a priority. Assuming everything goes according to plan, there's no reason you and Rachel can't petition for custody." "Assuming everything goes according to plan." The phrase echoed in Ethan's mind as he left the coffee shop. He'd spent 7 years building a life based on certainty and control, and now he was about to risk everything on a plan that had more variables than a calculus equation. But as he drove back to his empty house in Lincoln Park, he thought about the photos of Amelia, about the daughter he'd never held, about the chance to finally make Charles Whitford pay for everything he'd stolen. Some risks were worth taking, even if they cost you everything. The Palmer House ballroom glittered like something out of a fairy tale. All crystal chandeliers and gold leaf molding that spoke of old Chicago money and newer aspirations. Ethan adjusted his black tie and surveyed the crowd. A carefully curated mix of politicians, business leaders, and society figures who'd paid $2,000 each for the privilege of feeling good about themselves while eating overpriced salmon. He'd arrived fashionably late, as Chloe had suggested, giving himself time to locate the exits, identify security personnel, and spot the faces that mattered. Charles held court near the stage, surrounded by admirers and hangers-on, playing the role of benevolent philanthropist to perfection. "Ethan, you made it." Charles's smile was as bright as the chandelier overhead as he broke away from his group to greet him. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Wouldn't miss it," Ethan replied, accepting a firm handshake that lasted just a beat too long. Impressive turnout. The cause tends to attract generous hearts. "Come, let me introduce you to some people." For the next hour, Ethan played the part of potential major donor, nodding appreciatively at statistics about children served and lives changed, writing a modest check that would establish his credibility without breaking his bank account. All the while, he tracked the movement of Charles's security team and tried to spot Rachel among the catering staff. He found her refilling champagne glasses near the silent auction tables, her hair pulled back and hidden under a server's cap, her face expertly made up to look older and plainer than it actually was. She moved with professional efficiency, invisible in the way that service workers often were to wealthy people who saw them as part of the scenery. Their eyes met briefly as she passed his table, and she gave him the slightest nod, the signal they'd agreed on. "Everything is in position. Ladies and gentlemen," Charles's voice boomed from the stage, amplified by a wireless microphone that made him sound larger than life. "If I could have your attention, please. We have a very special treat for you this evening." The ballroom lights dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the stage where 23 children filed out in neat rows. They wore matching white shirts and dark pants, looking like any other school choir except for the way they moved, with the careful precision of children who'd been taught that perfection was expected, not optional. Ethan's breath caught as he spotted Amelia in the second row. She was taller than he'd expected from the photographs, with an unconscious poise that reminded him of Rachel at that age. Around her neck, catching the stage lights, was the small crescent moon pendant that connected her to the mother she'd never known. "These remarkable young people," Charles continued, "represent the future we're building together through your generous support. They've prepared something very special for us tonight. A song that speaks to the hope we nurture in every child who comes through our doors." The children began to sing, their voices blending in harmony that filled the massive ballroom. The song was "Paper Boat," a simple melody about dreams floating downstream toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Ethan had never heard it before, but something about the way Amelia sang, with her eyes closed and her whole heart in the words, made his chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Beside him, a woman in an expensive gown dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "They're absolutely angelic," she whispered to her companion. But as Ethan watched his daughter sing about dreams and futures, all he could think about was the cage that surrounded her, golden and comfortable. But a cage nonetheless. Charles had stolen 7 years of her life, 7 years of birthdays and bedtime stories and scraped knees that needed kissing better. The song ended to thunderous applause, and the children filed off stage with the same careful precision they'd shown arriving. Charles returned to the microphone, his face glowing with the kind of satisfaction that came from a perfectly executed performance. "Aren't they wonderful?" he asked the crowd. "Each one of these children has overcome tremendous obstacles to reach this point. They remind us why our work here is so vital, so necessary." Ethan checked his watch. According to Chloe's intelligence, Charles would spend the next 10 minutes working the crowd, accepting congratulations and basking in the glow of successful theater. The penthouse suite would be unguarded for exactly 15 minutes while his security team managed crowd control downstairs. He slipped out of the ballroom during the extended applause, taking the service elevator to the penthouse level as Chloe had instructed. The hallway was empty except for hotel security cameras that had been temporarily disabled by federal agents posing as maintenance workers. The suite's door was exactly where it was supposed to be, and the key card Chloe had provided worked on the first try. Ethan found himself in a luxury hotel suite that had been converted into a temporary command center. Multiple phone lines, secure computers, and file cabinets that probably contained enough evidence to bring down half of Chicago's power structure. Charles's laptop sat open on the marble-topped desk, its screensaver showing a slideshow of photos from various Dawnlight Institute events. Ethan plugged in Chloe's device and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Copying files. 15% complete. That's when he heard voices in the hallway. "Told you, the security sweep starts in 5 minutes." A man's voice, professional and urgent. "Mr. Whitford wants his briefing materials before the auction starts." A woman replied, "It'll just take a second." Ethan's pulse spiked as he heard a key card being swiped. The progress bar on the laptop showed 67% complete. The door handle turned. "Excuse me," Rachel's voice carried clearly from the hallway. "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's been a situation in the kitchen. They need all available staff downstairs immediately." "What kind of situation?" The woman's voice was suspicious. "Food poisoning. 3 guests have been taken to the hospital, and the health department is on their way. Mr. Whitford specifically requested that all staff be available to answer questions." Ethan heard footsteps retreating down the hallway as the laptop showed 89% complete. Rachel had bought him the time he needed, but barely. He held his breath as the progress bar hit 100% and the device automatically ejected itself. He pocketed the USB drive and was heading for the door when it opened again. This time, Charles himself walked in, looking uncharacteristically flustered. "Ethan?" Charles stopped short, his eyes taking in the scene. Ethan standing near the desk, the laptop still open, the general air of someone who'd been caught where he shouldn't be. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for the restroom," Ethan said, grateful that his years of corporate presentations had taught him to think on his feet. "Someone downstairs said there was one up here, but I think I got turned around." Charles's smile was sharp as a blade. "The restroom is down the hall to your left. This is my private office." "Sorry about that. These old hotels can be confusing." "Yes," Charles said quietly, moving to stand between Ethan and the door. "They certainly can be. Amazing how people end up in places they're not supposed to be." The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, and Ethan could feel the weight of 7 years of lies and secrets hanging between them. Charles knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't prove exactly what. "I should get back downstairs," Ethan said finally. "Don't want to miss the auction." "No," Charles agreed, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "You wouldn't want to miss that." As Ethan walked toward the door, Charles called out behind him, "Oh, and Ethan, next time you're looking for something, you might want to be more careful about where you look. Some doors are better left closed." Ethan nodded and left without responding, but he could feel Charles's eyes on his back all the way to the elevator. The message was clear. The game was no longer secret, and the stakes had just gotten considerably higher. Downstairs, the auction was in full swing, with wealthy bidders competing for vacation packages and art pieces, with the kind of casual indifference that came from having more money than they knew what to do with. But Ethan barely noticed the proceedings. All he could think about was Amelia, somewhere in this building, and the USB drive in his pocket that might be the key to finally bringing her home. Ethan made it through exactly 12 minutes of the silent auction before his phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Hotel bar now. Come alone." The Palmer House's lobby bar was dimly lit and mostly empty, the kind of place where business deals were made over expensive scotch and secrets were traded like currency. Chloe Bennett sat in a corner booth, nursing what looked like club soda and lime. Her red dress a far cry from the casual clothes she'd worn at the coffee shop. "You got it?" she asked without preamble, as Ethan slid into the seat across from her. He palmed the USB drive across the table. "Charles caught me in his office." Chloe's hand stilled for a fraction of a second before closing around the device. "What did you tell him?" "That I was looking for the bathroom. I don't think he bought it. Doesn't matter what he bought. What matters is whether the data transfer completed." She plugged the drive into a small tablet, her fingers flying over the screen. "How long were you in there?" "Maybe 3 minutes total. The progress bar hit 100% right before he walked in." "Jesus." Chloe's face went pale as she scrolled through whatever she was seeing on the screen. "Ethan, this is bigger than we thought." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she turned the tablet so he could see the screen. It showed what appeared to be a banking interface, but the numbers were staggering. Transfers in the millions, accounts in countries he'd never heard of, transactions that painted a picture of financial corruption on a scale that made his head spin. "This isn't just money laundering," Chloe said quietly. "This is human trafficking, arms dealing, political corruption that goes all the way to Washington." Charles wasn't just cleaning money. He was running a procurement operation for international criminals. Ethan felt sick. The children. The children are leverage, insurance policies to keep parents quiet, but also commodities. Chloe's voice was tight with controlled rage. Some of these kids aren't just being held, they're being sold. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Amelia wasn't just trapped in a fancy boarding school. She was inventory in some kind of sick marketplace where children were treated as assets to be managed and moved around. We have to get them out tonight. We will. But first, I need to get this data to my backup team. They're standing by to coordinate with local authorities. But we need to make sure Charles doesn't have time to destroy evidence or move the children. Chloe closed the tablet and stood, smoothing down her dress. Go back to the gala, act normal, in exactly 30 minutes. This place is going to be crawling with federal agents, and Charles is going to be in handcuffs. What about Rachel? She's still in there. Rachel can take care of herself. Your job is to stay visible and stay calm. If Charles suspects anything is about to happen, he might try to activate some kind of contingency plan. Ethan nodded, though every instinct he had was screaming at him to find Amelia and get her out of there immediately. 30 minutes. 30 minutes, Chloe confirmed, then melted into the crowd of hotel guests like she'd never been there at all. Back in the ballroom, the auction was winding down with the kind of artificial excitement that came from competitive rich people trying to outbid each other for charitable tax write-offs. Ethan found his table and tried to look interested in the proceedings, while his watch seemed to move backward. 28 minutes. Ethan! Charles appeared beside his chair like a magician's trick, all smiles and bonhomie. There you are. I was beginning to think you'd left us for the evening. Just stepping out for some air. These events can be overwhelming. Indeed they can. So much emotion. So much energy. Charles's eyes were bright, almost fevered. You know, I've been thinking about our conversation on the plane, about second chances and the importance of family. 26 minutes. Have you? Oh yes, it's fascinating how the past has a way of catching up with us. Don't you think how people we thought were gone forever sometimes have a way of reappearing? The way Charles said the word reappearing made Ethan's blood turn cold. He knew. Somehow, some way Charles knew about Rachel. I'm not sure I follow. Of course you do. Charles leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. I know about your wife, Ethan. I know she's here tonight, and I know why you really came to my gala. 24 minutes. Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, but Charles caught his wrist with surprising strength. I wouldn't, Charles said calmly. You see, I've taken the liberty of ensuring that your reunion with Rachel is properly chaperoned. My associate Mr. Kane is currently having a conversation with her in the kitchen. A very private conversation about the dangers of resurrection. The bottom dropped out of Ethan's world. If you hurt her, my dear boy. I'm not going to hurt her. I'm going to disappear her, permanently this time. And then I'm going to do the same to you. And to anyone else who's been foolish enough to interfere with my work. Charles stood and straightened his tuxedo jacket. But first, I think it's time you met your daughter. Really met her, face to face. Two men in expensive suits appeared on either side of Ethan's chair. Security that looked more like military contractors than hotel staff. They weren't rough, but their message was clear. Resistance would be futile and probably painful. Where are we going? Ethan asked as they escorted him toward a service exit. To see the real Dawnlight Institute, Charles said. The part we don't show to donors. They took a freight elevator down to what must have been the hotel's basement level, then through a series of corridors that seemed to stretch forever. The walls were concrete, painted institutional green, and the fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly cast. You see, Ethan, the public face of my organization is exactly that. A face, pretty and presentable and designed to make people feel good about themselves. But the real work happens down here, in spaces that don't appear on any building plans. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged in a prison. Charles produced a key card and swiped it through an electronic reader. Welcome to the future, he said. The room beyond was large and sterile, filled with computers and monitoring equipment that hummed with electronic efficiency. But what made Ethan's stomach clench were the photographs covering one entire wall. Hundreds of children, including several he recognized from the choir performance upstairs. My inventory, Charles said with obvious pride. Each child carefully selected, thoroughly documented, and strategically placed where they can do the most good. You're insane. I'm practical. Do you have any idea how much money there is in providing specialized services to very specific clientele? These children aren't victims, Ethan. They're resources, valuable resources that I've invested considerable time and money in developing. At the far end of the room, a door opened and Victor Kane emerged, pushing someone ahead of him. Rachel stumbled into the room, her server's uniform torn and her lip bleeding, but her eyes blazing with fury. "Hello, darling," Charles said to her with mock affection. "So good to see you again. You're looking remarkably well for a dead woman." 20 minutes. Rachel straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with the kind of defiance that had made Ethan fall in love with her in the first place. "Hello, Charles. You're looking remarkably evil for a philanthropist. Always the wit. I've missed that about you." Charles moved to stand behind one of the computer terminals. "Now then, shall we discuss terms? I believe you have something that belongs to me, and I have something that belongs to you," as if summoned by his words. Another door opened and Amelia walked into the room, flanked by 2 more security guards. She looked small and frightened, but her hand went instinctively to the crescent moon pendant at her throat. For the first time in 7 years, Ethan was in the same room as his daughter, and it might be the last time any of them were anywhere at all. 18 minutes. Amelia stood between the 2 guards like a small island of courage in an ocean of menace. She was close enough now that Ethan could see Rachel's stubborn chin and his own dark eyes, could see the way she held herself with dignity, despite being terrified. The crescent moon pendant caught the harsh fluorescent light, and he wondered if she understood its significance, or if it was just a pretty piece of jewelry to her. "Amelia, sweetheart," Charles said with the kind of false warmth that made Ethan's skin crawl, "I'd like you to meet some friends of mine. This is Mr. Calloway and Mrs. Rivers." The little girl's eyes moved between Ethan and Rachel, and something flickered across her face. Recognition. Maybe, or just the instinct children had for sensing when adults were lying about important things. "Hello," she said quietly, her voice carrying a slight tremor that broke Ethan's heart. "Hello, baby," Rachel whispered, and Ethan could hear 7 years of longing in those 2 words. Charles's smile widened. "Isn't this nice? A regular family reunion, though I'm afraid it's going to be rather short-lived." "Let her go," Ethan said, taking a step forward before Victor Kane's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "She's just a child. Whatever beef you have with us, leave her out of it." "Oh, but she's not just any child, is she? She's leverage, insurance, the guarantee that certain people will behave themselves in the future." Charles moved to one of the computer terminals and began typing. "You see, Mr. Calloway, your wife's little investigation 7 years ago cost me several very lucrative partnerships. I had to rebuild my network from scratch, which was both expensive and time-consuming. You killed innocent people. I eliminated security risks." "There's a difference," Charles continued typing, and screens around the room began displaying what looked like financial records. "But now I have the chance to recoup my losses and ensure that future disruptions are discouraged." 16 minutes. Rachel had been edging imperceptibly closer to Amelia, and Ethan realized she was positioning herself between their daughter and the nearest guard. The movement was subtle, maternal instinct disguised as nervous shifting. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, trying to buy time and hoping that Chloe's backup was already in the building. "What I've always wanted. Compliance. You and your wife are going to publicly recant any accusations you might have made about my organization. You're going to admit that Mrs. Rivers here is an unstable woman who faked her own death due to mental illness, and then you're both going to disappear, permanently, while I retain custody of your daughter as insurance against any future problems." "Go to hell," Rachel said flatly. Charles's expression didn't change, but he nodded to Victor Kane, who backhanded Rachel hard enough to send her stumbling. Amelia made a small sound of distress and took an instinctive step toward Rachel before one of the guards caught her arm. "Don't touch her!" The words exploded out of Ethan before he could stop them, and suddenly he was moving toward Victor, his hands reaching for the man's throat. He made it exactly 3 steps before something hard connected with the back of his skull, and the world turned into fireworks and static. When his vision cleared, he was on his knees, and Victor was holding a telescoping baton that explained the ringing in Ethan's ears. Violence is so unnecessary. Charles said mildly, though I suppose it runs in the family. Your wife was quite spirited when she discovered my financial arrangements 7 years ago, right up until she realized that fighting only made things worse for everyone she cared about. 14 minutes. Amelia was crying now, silent tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. The sight of her trying to be brave while surrounded by monsters made something cold and hard settle in Ethan's chest. Mama? Amelia's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly in the concrete room. Rachel's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What did you say, baby? You're my mama, aren't you? You smell like the lavender soap they use in the little kids' room, and you sing Paper Boat, the same way I remember from my dreams. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of computers and the sound of Charles's soft laughter. How touching, he said. Maternal instinct transcending 7 years of separation. It's almost poetic. You bastard, Rachel whispered. You told her we were dead. I told her what was necessary to maintain order. Children adapt remarkably well to loss when it's presented properly, though I must admit she's been more difficult to manage than some of the others. 12 minutes. That's when the building shook. It was subtle at first, just a vibration through the concrete floor that could have been a truck passing overhead. But then came the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridors above, followed by shouting and what sounded distinctly like doors being kicked in. Charles's face went from smug satisfaction to cold fury in the space of a heartbeat. Kane, get the vehicle ready. We're activating the extraction protocol. What about them? Victor gestured toward Ethan and Rachel. Kill them, but bring the girl. She's still valuable. 10 minutes. Victor raised his baton, and Ethan prepared to die in a basement room surrounded by computers and photographs of stolen children. But before the blow could fall, Rachel moved. She didn't attack Victor. That would have been suicide instead. She threw herself toward Amelia, wrapping her arms around their daughter and pulling her away from the guards. It was a mother's instinct, pure and desperate, the kind of move that said, "You'll have to go through me first." Amelia, listen to me, Rachel said urgently, her voice cutting through the chaos as alarms began blaring throughout the building. Remember the song from tonight? Paper Boat. I need you to sing it with me. Can you do that? The little girl nodded, and they began to sing together, their voices creating an island of calm in the middle of madness. Ethan watched in amazement as Amelia's fear seemed to melt away, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. 8 minutes. The door to the room burst open, and men in tactical gear poured through. FBI agents with federal agent blazoned across their body armor. Chloe Bennett was behind them, no longer looking like a marketing consultant, but every inch the federal law enforcement officer she actually was. Charles Whitford, you're under arrest, she announced, her weapon trained on the man who'd been untouchable for so long. But Charles wasn't done. He lunged for a red button on one of the computer consoles, some kind of emergency protocol that would probably wipe all the evidence, and maybe worse. Ethan didn't think. He just moved, tackling Charles away from the console and sending them both crashing into a bank of monitors. They went down hard, Charles clawing at Ethan's face while Ethan tried to pin the older man's arms. It was an awkward, desperate fight between two men who weren't really fighters, but the stakes made up for their lack of technique. You have no idea what you've done, Charles gasped, as Ethan finally managed to pin him. There are people who won't tolerate this interference. They'll come for all of you. Let them come, Ethan said, and meant it. 6 minutes. Victor Kane had produced a gun from somewhere and was backing toward another exit, using one of the other children as a human shield. But before he could reach the door, Rachel appeared behind him like an avenging angel, wielding a fire extinguisher she'd grabbed from the wall. The impact sent Victor sprawling, and suddenly the room was full of federal agents securing the scene and separating the children from their captors. Ethan found himself sitting on the floor, holding Amelia, while Rachel knelt beside them both, the three of them forming a small circle of family in the middle of controlled chaos. Is it over? Amelia asked, her hand clutching the crescent moon pendant. Yes, baby, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. It's over. But even as she said it, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago looked like a media circus. News vans lined the street, reporters jockeyed for position on the steps, and protesters held signs demanding justice for the children who'd been caught in Charles Whitford's web of corruption and trafficking. Ethan straightened his tie as he climbed the courthouse steps, Rachel's hand steady in his. Behind them, Amelia walked between two victim advocates, her small hand clutching a stuffed elephant that had become her constant companion since that night at the Palmer house. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of depositions, interviews, therapy sessions, and slowly learning how to be a family. Amelia had moved in with them immediately after Charles's arrest. But trust didn't rebuild overnight. She'd spent 7 years believing her parents were dead, and learning to call them mom and dad was a process that required patience from all three of them. "You ready for this?" Rachel asked as they approached the courthouse entrance. "As ready as I'll ever be," Ethan replied. Today was the final day of Charles's trial, and both he and Rachel were scheduled to give victim impact statements before sentencing. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Ethan recognized several faces from the gala 6 months ago, donors and supporters who now looked pale and uncomfortable as they learned exactly what their charitable contributions had been funding. In the defendant's chair, Charles sat ramrod straight in an expensive suit, looking every inch the successful philanthropist except for the federal marshals flanked on either side of him. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Patricia Santos presiding. Judge Santos was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through whatever facade people tried to present in her courtroom. She'd presided over the entire trial with the kind of no-nonsense efficiency that had made Charles's expensive legal team look increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against their client. "Please be seated," Judge Santos said. "We're here today for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Charles Edward Whitford. Mr. Whitford has been found guilty on all counts: money laundering, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and violation of the Mann Act." The list of charges seemed to go on forever. Ethan had attended most of the trial proceedings, watching as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the scope of Charles's criminal enterprise. It wasn't just the Dawnlight Institute. Charles had been running similar operations in 6 different states, using children as leverage to control parents, witnesses, and anyone else who might threaten his business interests. "Before we proceed to sentencing," Judge Santos continued, "the court will hear victim impact statements. Mrs. Rachel Calloway, you may approach the bench." Rachel stood and walked to the podium, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She'd written her statement weeks ago, revising it dozens of times until she'd captured everything she wanted to say. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion Ethan could see in her posture. "7 years ago, Charles Whitford stole my life. He stole my identity, my family, my daughter's childhood, and my husband's faith in the future. He turned my death into a lie, and my life into a prison." She paused, looking directly at Charles, who stared back with the kind of cold indifference that had probably served him well in his criminal career. But more than that, he stole the lives of 23 children who deserved to grow up in safety and love, not as commodities in his sick marketplace. He stole their innocence, their trust, their right to a normal childhood. Rachel's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I want this court to understand that Charles Whitford is not the philanthropist he pretended to be. He's a predator who used the mask of charity to cover crimes that would make hardened criminals sick. He deserves every year of prison he gets, and then some." She returned to her seat, and Ethan took her place at the podium. His statement was shorter, more direct. "Your Honor, Charles Whitford didn't just commit crimes. He destroyed families. For 7 years, I believed my wife was dead. For 6 years, my daughter grew up believing she was an orphan. He robbed us of time we can never get back, memories we can never make, and trust that we're still rebuilding." Ethan looked at Amelia, sitting in the gallery with her victim advocate. She gave him a small smile and touched the crescent moon pendant she still wore every day. "But he also taught us something important," Ethan continued. "He taught us that family isn't just about blood or living in the same house. It's about fighting for each other, even when the odds seem impossible. He tried to destroy us, but in the end, he only made us stronger." Judge Santos nodded as Ethan returned to his seat. The court has also received impact statements from 14 other families affected by Mr. Whitford's crimes. Additionally, we've heard testimony from federal agents. financial experts, and child psychologists about the scope and impact of these offenses. She shuffled through papers on her desk, then looked directly at Charles. Mr. Whitford, do you have anything to say before this court imposes sentence? Charles stood slowly, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. For a moment, Ethan thought he might actually show some remorse, some acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Instead, Charles lifted his chin and spoke in the same calm, reasonable tone he'd used at charity galas and board meetings. Your Honor, I maintain my innocence of these charges. The Dawnlight Institute was a legitimate charitable organization that helped hundreds of children over the years. The prosecution has twisted our good works into something sinister, using the testimony of criminals and con artists to paint a false picture of our mission. Murmurs of anger rippled through the courtroom, and Judge Santos gavelled for silence. Furthermore, Charles continued, I believe this prosecution is politically motivated, designed to punish successful businessmen who dare to operate outside the constraints of bureaucratic oversight. History will vindicate my actions and expose this trial for the witch hunt it truly was. He sat down without showing any emotion, as if he'd just delivered a speech about quarterly earnings rather than defending himself against charges of child trafficking. Judge Santos was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades spent dealing with criminals who thought they were above the law. Mr. Whitford, in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered a defendant who showed such complete lack of remorse for such heinous crimes. You have used the suffering of children to enrich yourself and protect your criminal associates. You have perverted the concept of charity and turned it into a weapon against the innocent. She opened a folder and read from a document. On the charge of human trafficking, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. On the charges of money laundering and racketeering, I sentence you to 15 years, to run consecutively. On the remaining charges, I impose additional sentences totaling 18 years, also to run consecutively. The math was staggering. Charles Whitford, who was 68 years old, had just been sentenced to 58 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars. Additionally, Judge Santos continued, I am ordering the forfeiture of all assets connected to your criminal enterprise, including the Dawnlight Institute properties, which will be sold and the proceeds distributed to your victims. Charles's face went white, as the reality of his situation finally seemed to penetrate his arrogance. His lawyers were already whispering about appeals, but everyone in the courtroom knew this was the end of the road. Court is adjourned, Judge Santos said, and the gavel fell with a finality that seemed to echo through the marble halls of justice. Outside the courthouse, Ethan and Rachel faced a wall of reporters and camera crews. They'd agreed to make a brief statement, partly to thank the FBI agents who'd risked their careers to bring Charles down, and partly to encourage other victims to come forward. Justice was served today, Rachel said into the microphones. But this isn't just about one man or one criminal organization. It's about protecting children and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. As they walked away from the courthouse, Amelia skipped between them, holding both their hands. She was still in therapy, still learning to trust, still working through 7 years of institutional life. But she was also learning to laugh again, learning to ask for bedtime stories, learning that it was safe to love and be loved in return. Are we going home now? She asked as they reached their car. Yes, sweetheart, Rachel said. We're going home. And for the first time in 7 years. Home felt like a place where all three of them belonged. 2 years after Charles Whitford's sentencing, the house on Elm Street in Lincoln Park looked like a home where a family actually lived. Amelia's bicycle leaned against the front porch. Colorful chalk drawings decorated the sidewalk, and the windows that had once been dark and lonely now glowed with warm light and the sounds of ordinary life. Ethan stood in the kitchen, watching through the window as Rachel pushed Amelia on the tire swing they'd hung from the old oak tree in the backyard. Their daughter's laughter carried on the autumn breeze, a sound that still caught him off guard sometimes with its simple joy. Dad, are you going to keep staring or are you going to help me with this math homework? Amelia called from the kitchen table, where she was wrestling with long division problems that seemed designed to torture 8-year-old minds. Sorry, kiddo. Ethan sat down beside her, marveling as he always did at how naturally the word dad had eventually started coming from her lips. It had taken 6 months of patient consistency, but trust had a way of growing when it was nurtured properly. Mrs. Patterson says I'm really good at math, but these division problems are tricky, Amelia said, chewing thoughtfully on her pencil eraser, a habit she'd inherited from him that drove Rachel crazy. "Let's take a look." Ethan guided her through the problem, watching her face light up when she finally understood the pattern. She was scary smart, just like Rachel had said, with a curiosity about the world that reminded him daily of how much time they'd lost and how precious the time they had now really was. "Got it," Amelia announced triumphantly, then immediately dove into the next problem with the kind of determined focus that suggested she'd inherited more than just his math skills. Rachel came in from the yard, grass stains on her jeans and her hair escaping from its ponytail. She looked exactly like the woman Ethan had fallen in love with 15 years ago, except for the laugh lines around her eyes and the small scar on her jaw that reminded them both of how close they'd come to losing everything. "How's the homework going?" she asked, dropping a kiss on the top of Amelia's head. "Dad's helping me with division, and I think I'm getting it. We're learning about fractions next week, which sounds scary but probably isn't really." "Probably not," Rachel agreed, catching Ethan's eye over their daughter's head. They'd gotten good at these silent conversations, the kind of wordless communication that came from learning to be partners again after thinking they'd lost each other forever. "Are we still going to the airport tomorrow?" Amelia asked, looking up from her homework with the kind of excitement that had been building for weeks. "We are," Ethan confirmed. "First thing in the morning." Tomorrow marked the end of Rachel's final flight. As Claire Rivers, after 2 years of winding down her assumed identity, she was finally ready to stop being the woman who'd been created out of necessity and fear. Claire Rivers was getting her wings permanently grounded, and Rachel Calloway was coming home to stay. It had been a complicated process. Legally and emotionally, the FBI had helped with the paperwork, expunging Claire's identity and restoring Rachel's legal status. But letting go of the person who'd kept her alive for 7 years had been harder than anyone expected. "I'm going to miss flying," Rachel said quietly, settling into the chair across from Ethan. "Not the hiding part, but the actual flying. There's something peaceful about being up there, seeing everything from a distance." "You could always get your pilot's license," Ethan suggested. "Learn to fly for fun instead of survival." "Maybe I will," Rachel smiled at the thought, "though I think I'd rather keep my feet on the ground for a while. I've had enough adventure to last a lifetime." After dinner and homework and the bedtime routine that had become sacred in their house, Ethan and Rachel sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, watching the stars come out over Chicago. It was October, crisp enough for sweaters, but still warm enough to sit outside and remember that they'd survived another day as a family. "Chloe called today," Rachel said, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "The last of Charles's associates were sentenced this week. The network is officially dismantled. All of them. All of them. Victor Kane got 15 years for his part in the trafficking operation. The judge in New York who was taking bribes got 10 years and disbarment. Even the Coast Guard officer who helped fake my death got 5 years. Though Chloe thinks he'll be out in 3 with good behavior. It had taken 2 years to unravel the full scope of Charles's criminal empire. The investigation had spread across 6 states and 3 federal agencies, uncovering corruption that reached into Congress, state governments, and law enforcement agencies. Dozens of children had been rescued from similar situations, and dozens of adults had been held accountable for their part in treating children like commodities. "What about the other kids from the Institute?" Ethan asked. "Most of them are doing well. The Morrison twins were adopted by a family in Michigan. Sarah Chen is living with her aunt in California and learning to play violin again. Marcus Johnson is back with his grandmother in Alabama." Rachel's voice carried the satisfaction of justice served, but also the lingering sadness of lives that had been interrupted and damaged. "They're resilient kids, more resilient than adults sometimes. Speaking of kids, did you see what Amelia left on my desk? The drawing. 3 stick figures standing in front of an airplane. She wrote 'my family' at the top, and we're all holding hands." Ethan shook his head in wonder. 2 years ago, she didn't even know we existed. Now she's drawing pictures of us like we've been together her whole life. "Children adapt," Rachel said. "They forgive easier than adults do, too. Sometimes I think she's handling all this better than we are." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling down for the night. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, a car door slammed, normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. "I've been thinking about the foundation," Ethan said eventually. After Charles's conviction, the court had ordered his assets liquidated and distributed to his victims. But Ethan had also made the decision to transform his own company, implementing transparency measures and ethical guidelines that went far beyond legal requirements. Part of that transformation had involved establishing a foundation dedicated to helping families reunite after trafficking situations. What about it? Chloe thinks there are at least a dozen other operations like Charles's still operating in the US, kids being held as leverage, families torn apart by criminals who think children are just another form of currency. You want to go after them. I want to help the families find each other again. The way we found each other. Ethan took Rachel's hand, feeling the warm metal of the wedding ring she'd started wearing again. We know what it's like to lose everything and get it back. Maybe we can help other people do the same. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, considering it would be dangerous work. The kind of people who traffic children don't give up easily. We don't have to be the ones kicking down doors. We can fund the investigations, support the families, help with the legal processes, use our money and our connections to make sure other kids don't spend 7 years believing their parents are dead. I like it, Rachel said finally, but only if we're careful. Only if we make sure Amelia stays safe and protected. She's been through enough. Agreed. Family first, everything else second. They went inside eventually, checking on Amelia one last time before heading to their own bedroom. She was fast asleep, curled up with her stuffed elephant and a book about astronomy that was probably too advanced for her age, but that she insisted on reading anyway. The crescent moon pendant lay on her nightstand, catching the light from the hallway. She'd stopped wearing it to sleep, but she still kept it close, a tangible reminder of the mother who'd never stopped looking for her, and the father who'd never stopped hoping. "Sweet dreams, baby," Rachel whispered, pulling the blanket up to Amelia's chin. In their own room, Ethan found 3 airline tickets on the dresser. Tomorrow's flight to New York, where Rachel would officially retire Claire Rivers, and they would take their first family vacation as the people they really were. "Where should we go?" Rachel asked, picking up the tickets and fanning them out like playing cards. "Wherever we want," Ethan said. "We've got the rest of our lives to figure it out." Outside their window, Chicago sparkled in the darkness, a city full of possibilities and second chances. And in their bed, Ethan and Rachel Calloway fell asleep holding hands, secure in the knowledge that some stories do have happy endings, even when they begin with loss and separation, and the kind of pain that feels like it might last forever. Because sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, the people you love find their way back to you. And sometimes, the family you thought you'd lost forever turns out to be exactly where you left them, waiting for you to come home